The narrow streets of Darkshire are quiet in the early hours of morning. Lanterns flicker dimly, casting long shadows that dance upon the cobbled stones. A figure stands alone by the town's edge, her dark cloak billowing softly in the cool wind. She stares towards the distant woods, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of trees that seem to stretch endlessly into the mist. There is a weight in her gaze, a burden she carries without words. Her hand rests briefly on the hilt of a sword, though she never draws it. To the townspeople, she is known as Watcher Sarah, one of many who guard Darkshire from the horrors that lurk beyond. She has walked these paths many times, patrolling the edge of the unknown beyond this hamlet, ever vigilant, ever watchful. But there is a sadness in her step, a quiet grief she never speaks of, not even to those she calls her companions. As the first signs of dawn struggle to break through the canopy, she turns her back on the forests. Her nightly patrol has come to an end, yet the air feels different this morning, heavier with an unfamiliar tension. Then, from the corner of her eye, the Watcher notices movement. A hooded figure, unfamiliar to her, strides into the town, his boots caked with the mud of distant trails, his gaze focused on the path before him. He is not one of her night watch, yet he moves with a purpose, as though drawn to something within these cursed woods. Sarah observes him in silence as he passes through Darkshire's gates and disappears into the thickening fog beyond. There is a part of her that wants to call out, to warn him of the dangers that lie ahead, but something holds her back and the words do not come. Perhaps it is the knowledge that some paths must be walked alone, or perhaps it is the unspoken understanding that fate has already set its course. Watcher Sarah remains silent as he disappears into the mist, letting him go toward the darkness that beckons him. The road due west leads through the heart of Duskwood, where even in daylight the shadows feel thick and oppressive. The trees that line the path are gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as though they would ensnare any who dare to pass. The lone wanderer presses onward in silence, his footsteps muffled by the dense fog curling around his boots like grasping tendrils. Each breath feels colder than the last, and with every inhale, the air seems to carry a heaviness that presses against his chest, as if warning him of the darkness ahead. Though he does not come to this place lightly. His path leads to Raven Hill Cemetery, a place deep within Duskwood, where stories have spread far and wide across Azeroth. Stories of the restless dead that wander between the graves and of the unknown terror that lingers, its full truth unspoken but ever present in the silence of the forest. As the trees give way to the entrance of the cemetery, the solitary figure pauses. Raven Hill stretches out before him, an endless sea of tombstones, many so old that their inscriptions have worn away, leaving only smooth, faceless stone. And at the heart of it all lies the weathered grave, the same grave the rumors had led him to. A passerby might not notice, but to those who know the land, those who have lived under the grip of its curse, this crude marker is a sign of something far darker. The traveller kneels, running his hand lightly over the disturbed soil surrounding the resting place. There is an unmistakable sense of wrongness in the air. The ground is uneven and unsettled, as though someone, or worse, something, had clawed its way out from beneath. After a short pause, the silent wanderer rises slowly, his gaze fixed on the wooden marker. The surface bears a faint inscription, weathered by time, but still recognizable, and at that moment, a cold wind stirs, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a name long forgotten in these lands.
Morgan Ladimore.
The name sends a shiver up the traveller's spine, awakening a sense of unease that he cannot shake. He steps back, his hand drifting to the pommel of his sword. This grave is not just a resting place for those no longer among us in life, it is a gateway, and whatever lies beyond it is not at peace. The weight of this revelation settles heavily on his mind as he turns away from the burial site. The hooded figure, against his better judgment, feels the pressing need for more information about the figure tied to that name. And he knows exactly where to find it. The journey back to Darkshire feels longer than before, as though the weight of his discovery clings to his every step. Yet, despite the burden, there is a determination in the traveller's eyes. The afternoon sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. In the distance, the outlines of Darkshire slowly come into view again, bathed in the soft light of the fading day. The lone wanderer wastes no time upon his return and seeks out Sira von Indi, the town's scribe and keeper of old histories. The old scribe looks up as the lone figure enters, his desk littered with tomes and scrolls, remnants of stories passed down through generations, many of which detail the cursed forest that now surrounds them. As the adventurer recounts the site of the disturbed grave, Sira listens with a furrowed brow, his fingers absently tracing the edges of a dusty book. At the mention of the name etched into the weathered grave, the town scribe's eyes widen, and he rises from his seat with an urgency that betrays the fear beneath his scholarly composure. Sira turns to a nearby shelf and retrieves a thick, dust-covered tome. He opens the book, revealing pages yellowed with age and a title etched in faded ink. The Story of Morgan Ladimore. The name resonates in the quiet of the room, like an echo returning from a long-forgotten place. Morgan was once a knight, Sira begins, his voice steadying as he speaks, a man of great honor who fought for the weak and the innocent. Fragments of Morgan's life begin to emerge, his noble deeds, his loyalty, his family, and then the war that took everything from him. Yes, the town scribe recounts, a great and terrible war. Summoned to fight in distant lands, Morgan answered the call of Lordaeron, joining the ranks of knights under the banner of Uther the Lightbringer. Thrust into the heart of a conflict against the rising darkness of the Scourge, Morgan faced terrors beyond anything he had ever imagined. He fought valiantly against hordes of resurrected abominations, battling relentlessly as the plague spread across the kingdom, turning friends and allies into the ranks of the undead. Alongside the paladins of the Silver Hand, Morgan witnessed the disbanding of his order, the death of Uther himself, and the fall of Lordaeron into ruin. Entire villages fell to the plague, their people turned into the walking dead. Morgan held the line, but every day he saw more comrades fall, more innocents consumed by the devastation around him. With every strike of his sword, he fought to hold on to the hope that his own family remained untouched by the darkness creeping across Azeroth. The adventurer listens in silence, the weight of the story sinking in. The scribe pauses, while his gaze lingers on the old texts, their yellowed surfaces faintly smelling of dust and history. The story of Morgan Ladimore does not continue in these pages, he says softly, before lifting his eyes to meet the travelers. If you wish to learn more, seek out Commander Ebonlock, Sira advises. She may hold the answers about this knight's fate. With the scribe's words still lingering in his mind, the lone wanderer steps out into the cold air of Darkshire. The afternoon has given way to the approaching evening, and the streets of the town are beginning to empty. The story of Morgan Ladimore remains incomplete, a puzzle of which many pieces are still missing. The traveller finds Commander Althea Ebenlock standing just outside the town hall, her armour gleaming faintly in the dim light of the nearby lanterns. Her eyes are sharp and calculating, but there is a weariness to her that speaks of the long years spent guarding a town beset by horrors. "You've learned of Morgan Ladimore, I presume," she says without turning. There is no warmth in her voice, only the crisp professionalism of a soldier who has seen too much death. Alas, there's more to his story than what Syrah could tell you. "I remember Morgan, back when this town was still called Grand Hamlet," she continues, her tone softening with the memory. "He was just a young man then, and at the age of 18, he married Liss, a woman of great kindness and beauty. Together, they built a life in the peaceful forests of Brightwood. The years passed in happiness, and they were blessed with 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. Morgan's heart was full, his family his greatest joy." Ebenlock's voice tightens as she speaks of the knight's return, and she looks the traveller in the eye, her expression grim. "For you see," the commander continues, "the battlefield played its part in breaking him, but what ultimately sealed his fate was what he found upon his return. Brightwood, the village he had left behind, had fallen. Corruption had seeped into the land, and by the time Morgan returned, the place he had once known was gone, swallowed by the darkness of what we now call Duskwood. He searched for his family, desperate to find them safe and unharmed. But all he found were ruins. His home, the village, everything he had fought for, reduced to ash. Deep down, the knight who had given everything for the prosperity of his homeland knew the answer to his quest. Still, he couldn't bring himself to fully seek it. When he arrived in Darkshire, the local priest delivered the devastating truth he had been dreading. His wife Liss and their children had not survived. They had fallen to the plague and were buried in Ravenhill Cemetery. Grief like that, it changes a man. A faint sigh slips through her words as she continues. It became more than he could bear, and in his desperation, the distraught knight rode to the kingdom's neighbouring lands, clinging to the fragile hope that his family had fled there, safe from the horrors that had claimed so many. He searched and searched, but found no trace of them. With no answers and his hope fading, he finally gave in and turned back toward Duskwood, unable to escape the devastating truth. For hours, Morgan wandered the graveyard of Ravenhill, calling out the names of his wife and children. The cemetery was overgrown, forgotten, its graves long neglected. At last, he came upon 3 small headstones hidden beneath the weeds. He brushed away the dirt and moss, revealing the names carved into the stone. Liss Ladimore, his beloved wife, their children buried beside her. Commander Ebenlock's voice grows softer, more somber, as she describes what followed. His sorrow overwhelmed him, and Morgan fell to his knees, begging the cold earth for answers that would never come. For hours he wept, his cries lost to the wind. Then, in his anguish and madness, he drew his sword and struck at the graves. His rage knew no bounds. He lashed out, blaming himself, blaming the war, blaming everything that had taken his family from him. Ebenlock's tone darkens. Cemetery attendants, hearing the commotion, tried to intervene. But Morgan's nobility turned into indiscriminate wrath. He turned his blade on them, slaughtering the innocent in his fury. By the time his rage subsided, the ground was soaked in blood. When he realized what he had done, he could not live with the guilt. The knight, who had once defended the helpless and innocent, now stood surrounded by the bodies of the very people he had sworn to protect. In his despair, he drew a dagger and plunged it into his own beating heart. The silence that follows is heavy with unspoken grief, and the traveler's hands tighten slightly within their gloves. Ebonlock glances away for a moment, her jaw tight with something akin to regret, before picking up the thread of her story once more. The villagers found Morgan's body the next day, lying among the dead he had slaughtered. They buried his lifeless remains quickly and quietly, without ceremony, in an unmarked grave, hoping to forget the tragedy that had unfolded in the shadows of Raven Hill Cemetery. But some things, some sorrows, refuse to stay buried. The commander turns back to the lone figure, her expression serious. "That is the story of Morgan Ladimore," she says softly. "A knight who fell not in battle, but to the weight of his own grief." The traveller remains silent, his mind racing with the images conjured by the tale. Ladimore's fall from honour, the madness that consumed him, and the tragedy that followed. These were not just the ramblings of an old book. They were the echoes of something darker, something still waiting to be uncovered. The commander points toward a figure standing quietly nearby, her gaze softening with a hint of sympathy. "Look, over there, one of Darkshire's brave Night Watch. She too knows what it means to carry the weight of that name." The traveller's eyes linger on the woman, noting the silent sadness etched into her features. And then, as if a veil lifts, the realization strikes him. Ebonlock watches the shift in his expression and nods solemnly. Yes, she is Sarah, the last living daughter of Morgan Ladimore. Sarah has been standing nearby, listening in silence, and as the commander falls quiet, she steps forward. "You speak of my father," she says softly. Her voice is steady, though her eyes betray a great heartache. "I was just a girl when my father left for the war. He was everything to us, but by the time he returned, everything we'd known, everything he had fought to protect, had already fallen into darkness. My mother, my brother, and sisters, they didn't survive." Sarah's voice trails off, her gaze momentarily meeting the traveller's eyes. The commander gently steps in. Sarah has served with the Night Watch ever since, carrying the memory of her father's tragedy in silence. "You've seen his grave at Raven Hill, haven't you?" Althea asks, in a low, knowing tone, her eyes searching the hooded wanderer's face for confirmation. "It was no accident that it caught your eye. Some things, as I said, refuse to be laid to rest, and Morgan is one of them." "Lately, we've received unsettling reports," Ebonlock says, her expression darkening. "People venturing too far into the woods near Raven Hill, only to vanish without a trace, with witnesses claiming to have heard agonizing cries that seemed to belong to those who crossed paths with a dark force they couldn't escape. Yes, there is something at work in Raven Hill. Something tied to the restless spirit of Morgan Ladimore." Sarah's hand trembles slightly as she slips a small, worn ring from her finger and extends it to the traveller. There's a moment of hesitation, as though she's reluctant to let it go. "Should you find him," she says, barely above a whisper, "lay this upon his grave. Let him know he has a daughter who remembers, who forgives." The lone wanderer accepts the ring and straightens his posture, the crisp night air biting at his skin. "I must go back," he murmurs, more to himself than to Ebonlock or Sarah. Whatever horror had risen from Raven Hill, he needed to confront it and put an end to its suffering, once and for all. With a nod of understanding from the commander, the traveller turns and begins his journey back into the heart of Duskwood, where the true terror of the forest waits to be uncovered. The night arrives fast and without warning, and feels heavy, as if the darkness itself presses down upon the land. The lone wanderer moves silently through the mist-covered path, the words of Commander Ebonlock still echoing in his head. Her warning was clear. Something unnatural stirs in Raven Hill, something tied to the soul of Morgan Ladimore. But it is one thing to hear a tale of madness and grief, and another to face whatever horror that has risen from the grave. As the road winds deeper into the forest, an unsettling pull tugs at the traveller's very core. He does not need to return to Raven Hill. He does not want to. Now, a force deeper than courage compels him, an unspoken feeling that offers no escape, no release. Something is waiting for him there, a truth he cannot ignore, and he must confront it. The night breeze slowly dwindles as the traveller nears Raven Hill, carrying with it the faint whispers of the dead. And before long, the outline of the cemetery emerges from the fog. His breath catches as he nears the weathered grave, the same one that bore the name Ladimore. The soil remains uneven, freshly turned, and for a moment he hesitates, his grip tightening as a sense of foreboding washes over him. There is a presence here, something far more evil than the undead that typically haunts these lands. He can feel it in the air, a malevolent force that pulls at him, beckoning him closer. But this is not curiosity that drives him now. And then, from the shadows, he sees it. A figure, gaunt and skeletal, cloaked in the tattered remnants of armor that once gleamed with honor. Its eyes burn with an unnatural green light, and its pace is rigid, deliberate, like a soldier bound to an unending duty. But there is no mistaking the fury that radiates from this creature, no mistaking the rage that drives it. This is no mindless bone chewer or simple flesh eater. What stands before him is the shattered soul of the once noble knight, twisted beyond recognition by grief and vengeance, now bound to a new name, cursed and forsaken. Mor'Ladim. The traveller draws his sword, the sound cutting through the stillness of the graveyard. The fallen knight's head turns slowly, its hollow gaze locking onto the figure standing before him. There is no recognition in those eyes, no trace of the man who once fought for justice. For a moment, the wanderer's resolve wavers. He had heard the stories, read the accounts of Morgan's fall, but to stand before the Revenant, it is more than he had prepared for. Alas, there is no turning back now. The creature must be stopped, its eternal torment put to an end, before more innocents fall victim to its wrath. Mor'Ladim lets out a low, guttural growl, while his skeletal hands clutch a sword that reflects a deadly sharpness, its edges unmarred by time. And then, before the traveller can react, he surges forward with a terrifying speed, closing the distance in an instant, as if no part of the graveyard is beyond his reach. The lone figure barely has time to react, raising his blade to deflect the attack. The force of the blow sends him stumbling backward, his boots digging into the soft earth. Mor'Ladim is fast, unnaturally fast for something that should be dead. But the traveller steadies himself, his mind focused on the task at hand. The fight is brutal. Each strike is met with a force that rattles the adventurer's bones, but he holds his ground. The fallen knight moves with a frenzy, driven by the memories of a life he can no longer reclaim. But with each passing moment, the traveller can feel the strength behind the blows weaken. Finally, with a calculated strike, he finds an opening. His blade slices through the air, severing the skeleton's wielding arm with a sickening crunch. The Revenant lets out a howl of rage, staggering backward, but it is too late. The hooded figure moves quickly, delivering the finishing blow. As the sword plunges into Mor'Ladim's chest, there is a moment of stillness. The creature freezes, its burning eyes flickering for a brief, final moment before the light fades from them forever. With a final shudder, the skeletal form collapses to the ground, lifeless once more, and the cemetery falls silent. The traveller kneels beside the fallen knight, his breath heavy, his mind still reeling from the battle, and he briefly brushes his hand against the cold metal of Mor'Ladim's rusted armor. But as he looks down at the broken body of Morgan Ladimore, he feels no triumph. There is only sorrow. This was not the fate of a villain, it was the fate of a man who had lost everything. Slowly, the lone wanderer rises, sheathing his sword. The battle is over, but the story is not yet complete. There is one more thing that must be done. With a heavy heart, he retrieves the tarnished ring from his pouch, the keepsake that Watcher Sarah had entrusted to him. The final act of love from a daughter to a father long lost. With careful hands, he places the ring on Mor'Ladim's weathered grave. In that instant, a gentle light glows from the ring. The fog that had shrouded Raven Hill for so long begins to dissipate, the oppressive darkness lifting ever so slightly. Then a spectral figure appears, a knight clad in resplendent silver armor, unmarred by age or battle. The spirit of Morgan Ladimore gazes at the ring with solemn reverence and turns to the traveler. This ring...
It's from her. My daughter lives.
With a nod of gratitude, his eyes alight with a quiet resolve. Morgan extends his hand, offering the brave adventurer his sword, Arceus, a symbol of hope and light, a relic of the noble man he once was. "I have no more need for it," he says, his voice steady. "May it carry forth the good that I could not." As the first rays of sunlight break over Duskwood, the traveler stands beside the grave, where a strange serenity settles over the land and the cemetery. The curse that had bound Mor'Ladim in the afterlife is lifted, and the spirit of Morgan Ladimore is finally at peace. With one final look, the knight fades into the mist, his soul, at last, released from its torment. As he departs into the hereafter, a parting whisper escapes his lips. A name carried softly into the dawn.
Lys, my love.